For a quarter millennium, the American dream was a cruel mirage, a nation proclaiming liberty while binding millions in chains. The institution of slavery warped the nation's soul and economy for centuries. It was a system built on the backs of countless individuals reduced to mere property, their humanity systematically denied. For African Americans in the South, life after slavery brought a great deal of changes. The horrors of slave life, including whippings, sexual assaults, family separations, and the denial of education, wages, legal marriage, and home ownership, were gone. African Americans finally found their freedom. Or did they really? Southern states introduced black codes, which on the surface granted some basic legal rights, such as the ability to marry, own property, and sue in court. However, these so-called rights were little more than a cruel facade. Beneath them were harsh restrictions that stripped black people of their dignity and freedom. It was illegal for them to serve on juries, testify against white people, or join state militias, leaving them powerless in a society designed to oppress them. Even worse, black codes forced black sharecroppers and tenant farmers into exploitative labor contracts with white landowners. Those who resisted this modern-day slavery were arrested and forced into labor, often under brutal conditions. These were truly hard and dehumanizing times for black people, as they struggled against a system built to keep them in chains long after slavery was supposed to have ended. Despite being free, most black Americans in the South lived in extreme rural poverty. Without education or wages from their time in slavery, many were forced to rent land from their former owners, paying rent through a share of their crops. In some areas, former slaves briefly took over land from their former owners after the Civil War, but federal troops soon returned it to the white landowners. Efforts by Republicans in Congress to provide land to former slaves failed, and they were never compensated for their enslavement. One can clearly see that African Americans were on the receiving end of immense cruelty and suffering in a society that they were merely forced to be in. After all of that pain, one may wonder how they managed to survive and even thrive in the United States. Join us through a journey of reminiscence and admiration for our ancestors who fought for their lives and their families' lives every single day until eventually they started doing more than just surviving. They started to live. After slavery ended, family, church, and school became the heart of black life. Many black individuals wanted to stay home, but poverty often forced them to work. Black churches became key parts of the community, offering spiritual support, education, social activities, and political organization. Black ministers served as community leaders. The strong desire for education led to the creation of schools at all levels, from basic grade schools to the first black colleges like Fisk University and Howard University. The Freedmen's Bureau, a government agency created to help former slaves, helped establish around 3,000 schools across the South and also ran hospitals and healthcare facilities for newly freed people. During Reconstruction, from 1865 to 1877, Congress passed and enforced laws that supported civil and political rights for African Americans in the South. Key among these were three constitutional amendments. The 1865 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 1868 14th Amendment guaranteed African American citizenship rights. And the 1870 15th Amendment granted black men the right to vote. African Americans embraced their new rights and responsibilities as citizens with a sense of pride and determination. For the first time, they had a voice in the political process and the opportunity to shape their own futures. The election of 700 African American men to public office, including 2 U.S. senators and 14 members of the House of Representatives, was a powerful symbol of progress. With Republican leadership in Congress, the federal government pushed for civil and political rights for African Americans, despite strong opposition from Southern whites. The presence of federal troops in the South helped protect these rights during the post-war period. However, also in the late 1860s, the Southern United States became a battleground for racial equality and political power. The Ku Klux Klan, a white supremacist organization, emerged as a force determined to resist the social, political, and economic advancements of black Americans. The Klan targeted black leaders, such as politicians, community organizers, and educators who were seen as threats to the established racial hierarchy. Through intimidation, violence, and murder, The Klan sought to dismantle the gains made during Reconstruction and maintain white dominance in the South. The KKK's reign of terror instilled widespread fear within black communities, suppressing voter turnout and undermining political participation. Their violent tactics aimed to maintain white supremacy and prevent black citizens from exercising their democratic rights. Black citizens who dared to use their newly won rights, including voting and holding public office, faced threats, assaults, and even lynchings. The Klan's actions were aimed not only at individuals, but also at dismantling the broader movement for black civil rights and equality. Eventually, the Congress took decisive action in response to the escalating violence and lawlessness. In 1871, under the administration of President Ulysses S. Grant, Congress passed the Enforcement Acts, also known as the Ku Klux Klan Acts. These laws were designed to protect the civil rights of black Americans and curb the activities of the Klan. The acts gave the federal government the authority to intervene in states where civil rights were being violated, allowing for the arrest and prosecution of Klan members. Federal troops were deployed to the South to enforce these laws, leading to the arrest and imprisonment of several Klan leaders. However, during the late 1860s and 1870s, the federal government gradually pulled military forces out of southern states. With the Compromise of 1877, President Rutherford B. Hayes ordered the final withdrawal of federal troops from the South. Without military enforcement of the 14th and 15th Amendments, Reconstruction came to an end. This led to a rise in lynching, voter suppression, and segregation laws across the South. It wasn't until after World War II and the civil rights movement of the 1960s that Jim Crow segregation was finally abolished. But what really has changed since then is the black community far better off today. More than 50 years ago, the 1964 Civil Rights Act had just started to break down racial discrimination in education, jobs, and public spaces. Black voters had only recently gained legal protections, and the 1968 Fair Housing Act was about to be passed. African Americans were only beginning to enter neighborhoods, colleges, and careers that were once reserved for whites. Compared to the late 1960s, it feels like a different world. Today, many African Americans hold positions of power, from mayors and governors to CEOs, and even a president. The U.S. seems like a very different place from 1968. But is it really different? While significant progress has been made for black Americans over the past 50 years, we are still fighting many of the same battles Dr. King faced in his time. The 1960s were indeed a chaotic time. During the long, hot summers from 1965 to 1968, about 150 race riots and uprisings erupted in American cities. These protests reflected deep frustration with a nation that, according to the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, was moving toward two societies, one black and one white, separate and unequal. Economically, this divide was evident. In 1968, only 10% of white people lived below the poverty line, while nearly 34% of African Americans did. Similarly, unemployment rates were starkly different, with just 2.6% of white job seekers unemployed compared to 6.7% of black job seekers. A year before his death, Dr. King and others began organizing the Poor People's Campaign to highlight the struggles of America's poor, regardless of race, and to demand a better life. On May 28, 1968, a month after King's assassination, the large anti-poverty march took place. People from all over the country set up a tent city on the National Mall in Washington, called Resurrection City, to draw attention to poverty issues. Ralph Abernathy, an African-American minister and Dr. King's close friend, took the lead. He said,
"We come with a call to open America's doors to the nearly 50 million Americans who have not received their fair share of the nation's wealth and opportunities, and we will remain here until we get it."
So, how far have black people come since 1968? Have we received our fair share? In some respects, progress has been minimal. Poverty remains widespread. In 1968, about 25 million Americans, or 13% of the population, lived below the poverty line. By 2016, this number had risen to 43.1 million, or over 12.7%. The poverty rate for black Americans today is 21%, nearly 3 times higher than that of white Americans. While this is an improvement from the 32% rate in 1968, it's not a significant change. Financial security also varies greatly by race. In 2018, black households earned $57.30 for every $100 earned by white families. Additionally, for every $100 of wealth held by white families, black families had just $5.04. Another worrying issue is the number of black families led by single women. In the 1960s, 20% of households had unmarried women as the main providers. Today, that number has gone up to 72%. This trend is worrying because single-parent households, especially those led by single women, often face economic hardships due to the lack of dual incomes. This can lead to increased financial instability, limited access to quality education, and fewer opportunities for children. The absence of a father figure may also contribute to emotional and social challenges for the children. Additionally, the strain on single mothers to provide for their families can affect their overall well-being, making it difficult to break the cycle of poverty and improve future prospects for the next generation. Black Americans today also rely more on government aid than in 1968. About 40% of African Americans qualify for welfare, housing help, and other government programs. This is higher than any other racial group in the U.S., with only 21% of Latinos, 18% of Asian Americans, and 17% of whites receiving welfare. Of course, there are also positive trends today. More African Americans are graduating from college, with 38% earning degrees, but this is compared to 50 years ago. Incomes have also improved. Black adults saw their income rise from $28,667 in 1980 to $39,490 in 2016, more than any other group in the U.S. This growth helped create a significant black middle class. Legally, African Americans can now live in any community they choose, from Beverly Hills to the Upper East Side. But why aren't these gains more widespread? Well-known thinkers such as award-winning writer Ta-Nehisi Coates and Michelle Alexander, author of The New Jim Crow, acknowledge that institutional racism is to blame for the challenges African Americans face. Coates even argues that racism has historically held back African Americans so much that reparations are necessary, reviving a long-standing demand in black activism. On the other hand, conservative thinkers like Ben Carson and Thomas Sowell argue that black people need to take personal responsibility for their problems. But depending on who you ask, black people aren't better off today because there's either not enough government help or too much. With all this being said, one has to wonder, what would Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. do if he was not assassinated? In 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Council envisioned a transformative approach to tackling inequality through the Economic Bill of Rights. This wasn't a legislative plan, but rather a moral vision for a just America. King emphasized that all citizens should have access to educational opportunities, homes, land, meaningful jobs with living wages, and secure, adequate incomes. King proposed initiatives to eliminate unemployment by creating more job opportunities for black Americans and supplementing the income of those living below the poverty level. Although these ideas were groundbreaking at the time, they seem quite forward-thinking today. King's vision of a living wage resonates with the concept of universal basic income, which is now gaining traction worldwide. King's influence can also be seen in modern politics, particularly in the campaigns of Senator Bernie Sanders during the 2016 and 2020 presidential primaries. Sanders advocated for equality, economic incentives for working families, improved education, and anti-poverty measures, reflecting King's ideals. While progress has been made since King's time, many believe it hasn't been enough to fully realize his vision. The segregation and marginalization of the black community is so severe that it almost seems like there is an evolving desire to remove the black community from the country entirely. But what would America even be like without black people? The idea of an America without black people has lingered as long as the dream of creating a true democracy. While we understand that achieving democratic ideals comes with a tragic cost, we often push this truth to the back of our minds, only confronting it during times of great national crisis. The notion of removing black people from the nation is so absurd that it hardly seems like a rational thought. It's more of a primitive reaction, a remnant from ancient tribal instincts, which we try to justify by cloaking it in the flawed concept of race. Yet despite its absurdity, the fantasy of an America without black people persists. This idea is born not just from racism, but from frustration, exhaustion, and a moral decline. It's a festering wound in the heart of democracy. At its most harmless, this fantasy can even be comically absurd, as seen in William Faulkner's story, The Bear. In the story, Percival Brownlee, a black man whose aspirations and talents lie in preaching and conducting choirs rather than farming, frustrates his white masters. They eventually free him, and he becomes a successful owner of a brothel in New Orleans. Faulkner uses this story to highlight the recurring themes of American history: white Americans' frustration and misunderstanding of black Americans, and black Americans' relentless fight to break free from the misconceptions imposed upon them by white society. Most importantly, the story reflects the persistent fantasy of solving America's problems by removing black people from the nation's core, both socially and historically. In reality, this fantasy ignores the profound impact black Americans have had on shaping the nation's identity and conscience. Removing them would not only strip the country of its diversity, but also erase the contributions that have been vital to America's progress and moral compass. The idea of a purely white America is not new. It dates back as early as 1713, when a white man, possibly from New Jersey, proposed freeing all black people and sending them back to Africa. Even Thomas Jefferson, in 1777, while serving in the Virginia legislature, started drafting a plan for the gradual emancipation and removal of enslaved people from the country. Surprisingly, even some black people entertained this idea. In 1815, Paul Cuff, a wealthy black merchant and shipbuilder, funded the relocation of 38 black individuals to Africa. This effort eventually led to the establishment of the American Colonization Society in 1816, which created the colony of Liberia in 1821. However, the motives behind this venture were deeply conflicted. Slave owners and some politicians saw it as a way to rid the country of free black people, who were seen as a threat to the institution of slavery. Abolitionists, at first, supported the idea as a way to correct a historical wrong, but later opposed it. Many black people went along with it out of frustration with the racial strife in America, hoping for a better life in Africa. The Colonization Society ultimately failed, but what is even more astounding than the belief in its success is that it was attempted at all, especially when black people made up 18% of the population. Given how long black people had been in America, contributing to its development and being shaped by it, the idea of removing them seems not only irrational, but a symptom of a deeper national illness. Despite their greatness, even some of America's most revered leaders entertained the idea of removing black people from the country. Thomas Jefferson considered it, and later, Abraham Lincoln also gave the idea serious thought. Historian John Hope Franklin noted that Lincoln viewed black colonization as nearly as important as emancipation. In 1862, Lincoln invited prominent free black leaders to the White House, urging them to support colonization by stating, "Your race suffers greatly, many of them by living among us, while ours suffers from your presence. If this is admitted, it affords a reason why we should be separated." Lincoln, despite his greatness, was a product of his time, limited by the less enlightened thinking of that era. His reliance on race to address America's challenges and his involvement in a plan to remove black people as a solution to the country's problems reflect a misguided attempt to heal the nation's fractured ideals. His motives, though seemingly well-intentioned, were rooted in a fantasy of solving the nation's struggles by severing a vital and indispensable part of it. This fantasy, akin to the illusion of secession, still lingers. Today, it manifests in movements like Neo-Garveyism, captivating some black individuals, just as it once mesmerized white Americans. Both fantasies surface whenever the nation tires of striving for true equality, using black people as scapegoats for national woes. However, both approaches, in seeking to cure the nation, would ultimately destroy it. What's most striking about this fantasy of removing black people from America is the lack of consideration for what the nation would be without them. No one who entertains this idea seems to reflect on the profound impact that African Americans have had on the creation of American history and culture. Nor do they seriously consider the consequences if any of these schemes for exporting black people had succeeded, beyond settling a small number in Liberia. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, known for stirring up racial discussions, co-authored a work that highlights how the American melting pot never fully integrated due to white ethnic groups fiercely protecting their identities. However, most Americans today don't truly know who they are. These ethnic groups, particularly their children, couldn't resist the pull of popular culture, movies, television, music, sports, and more. This cultural blending means that many white Americans are unknowingly influenced by Black American culture. If we set aside race for a moment and focus on the broader cultural impact, we see that despite the injustices faced by Black Americans, they have remained deeply connected to the nation's cultural mainstream. In fact, Black Americans are one of the primary contributors to this cultural landscape. If we move beyond thinking in terms of Black and white culture and view American society in a more unified way, we might better understand how much America owes to its Black population. America, as a nation, is shaped by its language, a unique version of English that began forming even before the British colonists and Africans became Americans. This language, born out of the challenges of a new land and influenced by many tongues, also carries the sound of the African voice. The rhythms, flexibility, and musicality of Black speech are deeply embedded in American English, from everyday slang to the most refined accents. Even revered American writers, like Mark Twain, drew heavily from Black culture. Without Black characters like Jim in Huckleberry Finn, the American novel as we know it wouldn't exist. Furthermore, without the creative tension between Black and white experiences, we wouldn't have the works of authors like Faulkner, Crane, or Hemingway, who drew inspiration from the Civil War and the struggles it represented. Black American culture has also influenced our jokes, tall tales, and even sports, with its unpredictable rhythms and sharp turns, elements that make life feel vibrant and dynamic. This unique blend of Black and white influences is often called soul, a powerful expression of resilience and creativity that defines much of America's cultural identity. Without Black Americans, the nation's culture would be far less rich, vibrant, and soulful. Without Black Americans, our political history would have been drastically different. The absence of slavery would have meant no Civil War, no violent end to Reconstruction, and no rise of the KKK or Jim Crow laws. Without the systematic disenfranchisement of Black citizens and the manipulation of racial fears, white Southern politicians wouldn't have held such disproportionate influence over both domestic and foreign policies. The intricate web of cultural, racial, and religious forces that define America today would be fundamentally altered. Without Black Americans, the nation's struggle for true democracy might have lacked its most critical test. The idea that democracy isn't just about material success, but about continuously perfecting itself through inclusivity would be less clear. The inclusion of Black Americans, rather than merely their assimilation, has been a vital measure of America's progress toward its democratic ideals. From the start, white Americans have faced uncertainty about their own identity. One way they attempted to resolve this was by defining themselves against Black Americans, using them as a symbol of otherness. Many whites saw Black Americans' social position as a simple gauge for determining who was truly American. This mindset was so ingrained that many European immigrants adopted racial slurs as a way to feel more American. Yet this created a paradox. Despite their attempts to distance themselves, something undeniably American about Black culture challenged the very value system whites relied on, leaving them with the unsettling realization that being American also meant, in some way, being connected to Blackness. Materially, psychologically, and culturally, the nation's heritage is deeply intertwined with the contributions of Black Americans, and whatever the country becomes will be influenced by their presence. This is a positive force because Black Americans are a constant reminder for the nation to live up to its ideals. They provide the creative tension necessary in the fight for justice and the elimination of social and psychological issues that lead to slums and unstable suburban communities. They challenge the nation to purify its language, ensuring that words align more closely with reality and that ideals are reflected in actions. Without Black Americans, something vital, hopeful, and creative would be lost from the American spirit, potentially leading the nation to succumb to the moral decay that has always threatened it from within. When examining the nation's structure objectively, it's clear that one group had to face the harshest realities of the human condition in a democracy as fortunate as America. This group was stripped of the ability to escape these realities through moral equivocation, racial superiority, or higher social status. For Black Americans, There is no refuge in suburbia, penthouses, the countryside, or cities. They are a people grounded in reality, yet driven by a vision of what human life could be in this society. The nation cannot afford to lose their presence because, through the irony of American democracy, Black Americans embody both the greatest challenges and the greatest potential for human freedom in the United States. Thank you for joining us on reminiscing about the previous struggles of the Black community, while also helping shape the country we know now. If you found value in this exploration, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for similar discussions. Share your thoughts and questions in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, keep seeking the truth and expanding your understanding of the world.